Jordan found out a lot of things while he was in Flint that I found out in Buffalo. So if you didn't know, Buffalo is ground zero for lead poisoning in the United States. The east and lower west side of Buffalo, 40% of children tested high for lead levels, some of them 8 times higher than that of Flint, Michigan at its peak. Now, this isn't to say to take away from the problem in Flint, not at all. This is to say this is happening all over the country, and there are some places that are much worse. And now, of course, Flint has problems with their water that go beyond just lead. There's other chemicals and things going on with their water there that is continuing to make people sick. But so this has been going on in Buffalo. I think the first report came out in 2002 where they tested neighborhoods, and the lead levels, these children were testing, 40% of these children were testing high, dangerously high for lead levels. Once again, some of them 8 times higher than that of Flint. That came out in 2002. And since then, nothing has been done. Nothing has been done. So this information was gained through the Freedom of Information Law. We requested records from 2002, 2005, 2008, 2011, 2014. Again, this is in Buffalo, New York, requesting information on lead. The records show that the city did not test the water in the neighborhoods where children were testing high for lead poisoning. Instead, they tested the neighborhoods where children were not testing positive for lead at all, or very, very, very minute amounts of children had tested positive for lead. Only 1/3 of the samples the city collected came from homes in the 5 zip codes that were the highest lead levels, where 91% of the children were testing reported high lead poisoning. These neighborhoods are 66% minority. They did not test in those neighborhoods. Instead, the city focused on predominantly white neighborhoods in North and South Buffalo that reported few, if any, lead poisoning cases. The city collected only 5 of the 300 samples in the past 5 rounds of testing from homes located in the zip codes that tested positive for lead. It collected 5 of 300 samples from the zip codes that tested positive for lead. By contrast, the city collected 41 of the 300 samples from homes and zip codes that cover predominantly, again, white neighborhoods where not a single child was diagnosed. This is a violation of federal laws. But what do we have laws for anymore if they mean nothing? I mean, laws only apply to average people like you and I, right? This is a federal law. The city broke it, but nothing happened. So what is the use of having these laws? They look good on paper. They violated the city law because the law said that testing should focus its efforts on houses that are most at risk, which they did not. Federal law requires that at least half of the homes sampled are deemed most at risk, which they did not follow that law. The law requires every home sampled have lead plumbing, and at least half must have lead service lines that run from the street into the homes. Now, the records that were obtained showed that 62 homes sampled in 2014, only 28 households had lead service lines. So again, breaking federal law. But it didn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. The law doesn't apply. Among the homes the city sampled, 1/4 of the houses sampled in 2014 belonged to current or former employees of the city and their family members. Many of those employees worked for Water and Public Works Department. Among the homes the city sampled that year was the former chief plumbing plant engineer, employed by the city for 30 years, a water treatment supervisor, employed for 28 years, a chemist, employed for 23 years, public works employees, a parking enforcement officer, a senior engineer, an assemblywoman. They're testing all these people's water for lead, but not the 5 zip codes where children were testing 40% positive for incredibly high lead levels. But it's not just that they're doing this, they're testing it and it goes nowhere. Then they're going on the news and they're going in the newspaper and they're saying Buffalo has no water problem because they didn't test the right homes, they didn't test the right zip codes. So in response, the mayor said, I'm not concerned because our water is good in the city of Buffalo. And when this came out, people were, it was going around, Buffalo has a lead problem. The mayor went on the news with this information that they did from the skewed water testing and told the public, these are the results of the test, our water is good. So they didn't test the right areas, the water wasn't good. People in those 5 minority zip codes, their children are sick, their children are suffering, their children are still struggling to this day. This was 2002, it is 2018 right now. Nothing has been done. And so it's lies, it's being covered up, but the children are still sick. So the mayor said that anyone can participate in the city's sampling program to test their waters, and that we're not ignoring the neighborhood. He said they have the ability to contact us and request water to be tested, and that they're receiving flyers in the mail is what he said. I spoke to a lot of people. I personally went and spoke to a lot of people that said flyers never came to their home. So we did a little digging. We found out that the flyers were being sent to the landlords of the homes. So if you have a house where you have 2 families living in it, 4 families living in it, the landlord's getting that piece of paper that says, if you want your water tested, please call us, contact us here. The people living in the homes never got that paper. And of course, the landlords aren't going to want the residents to know that there's a lead problem in their home, because then they're going to have to fix it. So that's very strategic, of course, by the city, that they would put out these flyers and send them only to landlords and not in the mail of the residents. They definitely did it on purpose. And then they could go on the news again and say, we sent out flyers to all the residents, everything's okay. Those residents, they got the flyers, and if they want to get their water tested, they can. The residents never got the flyers. The residents never got their water tested. So Buffalo's aging drinking water infrastructure is part of the growing problem in New York, and it's not the only problem. It is estimated to cost $40 billion. So why would our government want to put $40 billion into fixing the drinking water for minority neighborhoods, right? I mean, we have more important things like dropping bombs on Syria and Yemen and building a wall and paying the upper 1%, giving them tax breaks. That's what we want to do. That's what our politicians want to do in this country. They don't want to take care of the actual citizens. They're catering to the billionaires and the huge corporations, the industrial war machine and such, and their own pockets. So they are largely ignoring the fact that children's lives are being robbed, their futures are being robbed across the country. And I'll tell you in a minute, this is a nationwide crisis. It's not just Buffalo, it's not just Flint. So the Guardian newspaper found that at least 33 cities, including Buffalo, used cheats that could reduce the amount of lead in drinking water for sampling. And I spoke to the residents about this. I have some interviews. I will post them. And they said this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what they were told to do. Or if someone did come to their house to test the water, this is exactly how it went. In fact, Buffalo's water utility was one of the handful that cheated on all 3 measures. by instructing the residents to, and this is the cheats, and this is what Jordan found out that they were doing in Flint. This is the cheats. This is what they do to make it seem like if they do test the water, that the water is clean. Number one, flush faucets prior to testing, which removes water that may have been in contact with lead plumbing. Clean filter screens inside faucets, which can remove flakes of lead. Literally, they told the residents, or they would come and test the water, and they would remove the filter and clean it before they tested the water. Run the water slowly while collecting samples, and that prevents any additional lead particles from flaking off inside the pipes. Just doing everything they possibly can to make sure that they cheat and the results are skewed, so that they don't have to put a dime into fixing the infrastructure, into literally ensuring that the Americans of this country have a future, that the children have a future. Because what happens when people have lead poisoning? They have learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, proclivity to violence. It is a neurological, it impairs you neurologically. And not just that, I mean, one of the women I interviewed, her daughter was right there with us. She goes to the hospital 2 to 3 times a month at this point. And unfortunately, she's still living in the house. Her lead levels were testing 40, which you're supposed to have 0 lead in your blood. And they're saying anything over 4 or 5 requires like a public health assistance. And this child was between 30 and 40 on a regular basis. And sometimes she would have to get, I can't remember if it's called chelation on a regular basis. She would have to clean her blood. And the Department of Health knew about this. The Department of Health had been to her home multiple times. HUD knows about this. The city knew about this. This is one example of how many are in Buffalo that are suffering the same fate. And this poor child is now, I think she's 12, and she suffers, and she still lives in the same home because in her case, her mother went to HUD housing and she said, we have lead in our home. My daughter has tested high for lead levels. And they said, if we move you to a different house, it's going to have lead anyways. So and what they instructed her to do was to paint over the paint in her home. Because in Buffalo, they want people to think it's just about the paint on their houses and not the water. Because the water would cost, as I said, in Buffalo alone, what was it, $40 billion. Can you imagine the entire state? Can you imagine the entire country? Anyways, yeah, it was something like 40 billion. So in Buffalo, that's another thing that they're trying to do, is to make the residents believe it's in the paint, which it is. They have lead in the paint, they have lead in the pipes coming from the street, and they have lead in the pipes in the house. So they have a lot of fixing to do. And that's why they're doing everything they can to skew the tests and lie, and which they're being successful at. They're burying the truth. They're burying it on purpose. But so they told her, this woman, stay in your home and just paint over the paint in your house because the paint's flaking off and that's where the lead is, which they were right. But even after she painted over the lead in her home, her daughter was still testing high for lead levels. And that's what happened all over Buffalo, is that they were trying to say it's the paint. It's the paint and the lead. It's chipping off. So when people would paint over this lead paint in their house, which is supposed to be how you seal it in and prevent the lead from coming out, the children were still sick. And they would contact the city and they'd say, look, we remediated the lead from the paint in our house, yet my daughter, my son is still sick, still has super high lead levels. And the city said, well, it's you, it's not us. And no, there's no lead in the water. Look, we did this testing. I interviewed another woman who, her daughter had super high lead levels, and they started blaming, they remediated the house, the paint in the house, and they went back to the city and they said, our daughter's still very sick. It has to be in the water. And the city literally first blamed it on the husband, that he's tracking the lead into the house. So take off your boots and your jacket and your everything, change your clothes before you enter the house. So this man would come into the house, stand between the two doorways, take off all his clothes every day after work, put it in a plastic bag, get dressed, come into the house. That's what he had to do to survive. Well, that wasn't working. They got back to the city continuously. They were very persistent. Other people are so tired of it, they just give up. And they told this woman at this time, it's because you're buying toys from the dollar store, and the toys have lead in them. So they got rid of all the toys. The daughter is still sick. The lead's in the water. The lead is in the paint, but the lead is in the water, and they're doing everything they can, as they are in Flint, to hide it. So they're skewing tests. They had a grant program. So this is when the mayor gets on TV and he's like, okay, well, we found lead in some of the houses in Buffalo. We found lead. And we got this grant from the state. We have this program, this green program. We're going to remediate the houses. So this was in 2011. The grant program addressed 1% of the city's total at-risk housing units. Oh, sorry, since 2009. 1% since 2009 they took care of. And that's just talking about paint, because they're still in denial that there's a problem with the pipes and the water in Buffalo, which there is. And sadly, Buffalo had this, what did they call it? $1 million. It was $1 billion. It was $1 billion that they were investing into Buffalo's infrastructure. And everybody thought they're going to take care of the lead crisis in Buffalo, and they ended up just actually gentrifying the entire neighborhood and pushing people out of their housing units and moving in, demolishing them and putting in trendy high-rise lofts that the residents could not afford. So that increased the number of homeless people in Buffalo, which has been, through the roof in the past few years. And they also took that money to put it into the medical corridor. Again, we have Roswell Park, one of the biggest cancer institutes in the country, yet the people who live in that area in the low-income neighborhoods can't afford to go to Roswell Park when they get cancer. They get sent to an old hospital outside of the city. But again, a lot of people were pushed out of their homes to build the medical corridor as well. And again, people were pushed out of their homes because they had to build these fancy houses for the new doctors and medical staff coming into work in the medical corridor. So there was a lot of gentrification with that. So instead of using the $1 billion to help the people of Buffalo with the lead crisis, and the lead crisis is just scratching the surface, because we have other problems as well with our water, PCBs, coke sludge, arsenic in the water, lupus. It just goes on and on. But none of that $1 billion was spent on the people. It hurt the people more than anything. And that's what's happening nationwide.